So I'm going to start with just a couple things besides the war in Iran for a moment, just to notice them because, right, um, the world doesn't stand still even when we are consumed with a big story. Let me actually come out of the slides while we're doing that. And so I'll start with the idea that there were elections on Tuesday, right? Primary elections for the forthcoming congressional elections, the midterm elections, which will be happening this November. And two things I would say: if you're a Democrat, you're liking your chances for regaining control of at least one House of Congress, and in the long shot, good scenario, both houses of Congress, the Democratic turnout was extensive, right? And it appears the Democrats are deeply mobilized by what's happening in the country. Um, but I want to notice one other thing, which is that there seems to be a strong anti-institutional surge in the American electorate. It's in the Democratic Party, right? Some of the best known names went down to insurgent candidates, but it's also there in the Republican Party. And this raises the question, right? Which is Donald Trump came to power in the Republican Party a decade ago as an insurgent candidate, as an anti-institutionalist, campaigning against mainstream Republicans. And does he still remain 10 years later in his second term an anti-institutionalist, or is he increasingly identified with the institutions that so many people are angry with and don't think are working very well at all? And so there's just the question of timing, right? You know, can you really be anti-institutionalist when you're in your sixth year of being president of the United States? But there's also the question of policy, right? Donald Trump ran against the idea of keeping the United States out of forever wars. And here we are, right, launching another war. And right, this will be the eighth time that Donald Trump has let bombs loose on another country, right? And so you combine that with, right, the fact that we just got a jobs report, which is, right, very lackluster, that the price of gasoline is going up rapidly, that many people don't think that the tariffs, et cetera, have worked right for us. And then, right, of course, the brutalization of many constituencies by the Department of Homeland Security. Is Donald Trump really still at the forefront of the Make America Great Again movement? We've already got a fight underway to replace him at the head of that movement. Is it going to be increasingly the case that he's a drag on the Republican Party? And is it then the case that just the pure dynamics of electoral competition push Republicans to be increasingly distant from Donald Trump, to regain some independence, to revive the independence of Congress in the buildup to the 2026 election, as opposed to having to wait for the Democrats to maybe take over in the aftermath of the 2026 election. So that's thing number one. We talked right just at the very end there about the brutality of the Department of Homeland Security. Then, of course, Kristi Noem is out as the secretary, right? The cabinet member in charge of the Department of Homeland Security. I'll say this very quickly, right? The Department of Homeland Security is the third largest agency in the federal government. And by the way, with its expanding funding, it is growing, right? And Kristi Noem had little competence, and it appears even less interest in competently managing this sprawling agency, and was much more interested in optics, in amplifying the ruthlessness and lawlessness of the way in which ICE and Customs and Border Patrols operate, and extending that operation inward, right, into the interior of the country and away from the border. And so I would suggest, right, that Kristi Noem did more to mobilize public opinion against ICE and Department of Homeland Security than people on the left have done in 2 decades of campaigning against it, right? So the idea that in many ways she was incompetent, right? FEMA is barely functioning. Cybersecurity, I dread to think what's happened under her management. And this is a sprawling range of unrelated or at best loosely related functions that were consolidated under the Department of Homeland Security in the aftermath of the September 11th attacks. And now, right, you've got an incompetent, and I love what the New Yorker said, which is if Donald Trump were trying to replace Kristi Noem with the male version of Kristi Noem, he couldn't have done better than to get Markwayne Mullins, right, from the Senate from Montana, a former mixed martial art fighter who apparently challenged someone to fisticuffs in the middle of a Senate hearing. And Bernie Sanders, who was chairing that hearing, had to say, sit down and please remember that you're a U.S. Senator now. Right. This is not going to be, I think, a transition into more competent and less polarizing leadership. So those are 2 things that I'm paying attention to in addition to Iran. But I have a lot to share with you about Iran today. So with your permission, I'm going to jump right into that. We can return to those other topics at the end if you would like. So in terms of Iran, we are now beginning week 2. And I obviously spoke with you about this last week. But last week it was very much seat of the pants. I did my best to come up to speed as best I could. Today I have some more analysis to share with you. And my organizing idea, although I will update you with information as best I can, is to outline 3 scenarios. And I've listed them in the order of likelihood, I think, in terms of the outcome of this war. And so the first and most likely scenario is regional chaos. And in saying this, I'm going to suggest that this will weaken the Iranian regime, perhaps create a failed state in Iran, maybe the dismemberment, the breaking up of Iran into several autonomous areas, and perhaps a protracted civil war. But you will see. I do think that there is a possibility that this will produce the Israeli and American campaign, the right images of which I have arrayed on the opening slide, will actually lead the people of Iran to rise up and the regime to lose its will and nerve to put them back down. I think that's the least likely scenario. But if we have to note, right, that you never know what's going to happen in this kind of conflict. And that is one of the possibilities. If that doesn't happen, and then I don't know exactly where to draw the timeline, right? But if that doesn't happen rapidly, let's say to make it what I think is kind of the limits of Donald Trump's patience for involvement as the political costs continue to go up. If this doesn't happen within 2 to 3 months, then I suspect Donald Trump walks away. Right. And in saying that, we could note what he has said in his initial address on this and several times since, that he has given the people of Iran the opportunity to seize control of their society, and it's up to them to do so. And I think this is a deeply naive perspective in terms of the staying power of the regime, its willingness to use violence to repress the people, including if they rise up, and the lack of internal organization of a meaningful opposition in Iran, right? So the preconditions for rapid and positive regime change seem to me not to be present. That's why it's the least likely outcome. And so if it doesn't happen in the time frame that exhausts Donald Trump's willingness to absorb the costs, the costs in terms of his standing with the American people and his MAGA movement in particular, and he campaigned against forever wars and regime change and democracy building abroad. And here he is doing it. It seems quite likely that this will further fracture the MAGA movement and increase the race to succeed Donald Trump and in a sense to push him out of the leadership of the movement he founded, right? And so as he sees that begin to take shape, my guess is that his temptation to cut and run, to declare this a success, we killed the Khomeini, we decapitated the regime, we took out the nukes, we took out the missiles, our mission is accomplished. Now it's up to the Iranian people to put Humpty Dumpty back together again if they can. That, I think, likely results in regional chaos, not just in Iran, but as refugees spill into neighboring areas. If Iran becomes a failed regime and more radical insurgent groups take over and begin to harry the neighbors, if the Strait of Hormuz remains impassable, right? The idea that that's the most likely scenario is, to my mind, indicative of how poor the planning or thinking or strategy behind this war is. The second scenario, a long and costly ground war. And so I don't think this is very likely. I'm not sure that it's more or less likely than rapid and positive regime change, but the idea that we get further involved. And Donald Trump has said in the last couple of days that what he's after is unconditional surrender, that he wants say in who replaces the leadership in Iran, who the new leader of Iran is going to be. I'm going to say this directly by using an analogy. And the analogy is with Israel and Gaza, right? And so the idea that if the United States were to try to occupy Iran, in order to, right, not just dismember the regime, right, which I think so far we're in the early stages of doing, and that it's going to be very difficult to do from the air alone. So if we're serious about regime change, we'll have to have boots on the ground. That it's likely to lead to a long and costly occupation. To think about this just for a moment, right? The Israelis invaded Gaza in the aftermath of the October 7th slaughter. And they did so, right, in order to dismantle Hamas. And 2.5 years later, right, Hamas is resurgent, right? The territory it controls, it's beginning to tax again, it's beginning to police again, it's beginning to govern again, it's beginning to rebuild its military capacity again. And I did the math. Gaza is about 150 square miles. Iran is about 960,000 square miles. That means Gaza is 0.02% the size of Iran. Gaza has a population of about 2 million people. Iran has a population of over 90 million people, right? And so population right, about 2-3% of the Iranian population, the idea that what Israel could do to its neighbor, right, through a sustained, destructive, costly, deadly ground occupation would be dwarfed by what would be necessary to dismantle this regime, assuming this regime stays willing to exercise violence in its society. And I see no sign that it is. Like Hamas, right? The Iranian Revolutionary Guard, right? That they are motivated by ideology, right? A messianic ideology, a religious ideology. They are also motivated by the fact that they have been enriched substantially by this regime, and that if this regime falls, it is quite likely that they will be, right, as the functionaries of the regime, but also as the beneficiaries of a kleptocracy that's stolen so much from the people of Iran and that has repeatedly turned its guns on the people of Iran, that they will be jailed, that they will lose their wealth, that they will lose their status, or simply they will be killed, they will be executed, right? Leads them to fight for their lives, for their privilege, for their wealth. And I don't see, right, us taking them out for the air. So if we really are serious about unconditional surrender, regime change, then that's the second scenario. The third scenario, right? And I don't think it's impossible, right? The people of Iran have been rising up against their government despite the ruthless violence that the government has rained down on them repeatedly since 2009. The people of Iran are so tired of repression, and in particular, the religious zealotry, the repression of women, the right imposition of orthodoxy on a population that is largely secular, cosmopolitan, Western looking, and the impoverishment of their society by a corrupt kleptocracy that I think it's incredibly right likely that there will be some kind of uprising. The question is, can it succeed? And there I'm much less hopeful or optimistic, and in part simply because I don't see the regime as sufficiently weakened that it's going to lose nerve, and it has the monopoly on the instruments of coercion necessary to prevail and the willingness to use them, as far as I can tell, in part because the opposition is so disorganized. Many brave people willing to come to the streets, but not clear leadership, nor right that level of organization necessary to create rapidly an alternative regime to the current regime. So I have on the board the images of destruction, right? The Ayatollah Khomeini's compound, which I showed you last week, the remnants of it after he and several of his deputies have been killed. A square in Tehran that was subject to a double tap attack, so-called, right, where a small bomb goes off and then people run into the streets, often to try to aid the people who have been the victims of the first bombing and then a second large bombing. And so I think we need to recognize, right, I will say this briefly. The Israeli Defense Forces, in the aftermath of October 7th, removed many of their constraints on acceptable collateral damage from aerial bombing, right? Aerial bombing tends to produce civilian casualties. It is, despite the fact that we try to use guided missiles, etc., very often the case that the missiles will be off by 100 feet or 100 yards, as is the case with the 175 odd school children who were killed last week, right? The missing by 100 yards means you're hitting a school instead of a military facility. But once the constraints are off, right, and you're no longer weighing, right? What's the acceptable risk in terms of so-called collateral damage or civilian casualties? You get attacks like this. I don't know what constraints the U.S. military is putting in place, right? And I'm not inclined to believe that Pete Hegseth or Donald Trump have much by way of humanitarian or legal concern. I don't know if the internal culture of the military is sufficiently strong to resist Hegseth or the civilian leadership urging them to do things that would be, I think, under our law and international law illegal. But I do think, right, what we are seeing on the ground is signs of the deep inhumanity of war, but also potentially of illegal, unconscionable forms of attack. And then, of course, Iran is not obeying any constraints, right? And so is bombing civilian targets as well as military targets as well as economic infrastructure throughout the region. I have a image of a Israeli apartment complex having been bombed and basically destroyed by Iran. I won't go into great detail today, some of the stuff we did last week about the extent of the war. I will say very quickly a few things about what we know about the campaign to the best of our knowledge up to this point. I've seen some quantification, and it appears that a third of the U.S. naval capacity, half of our mobile Air Force capacity is in the Persian Gulf right now. This is a tremendous buildup. The estimates are that tens of billions of dollars have been spent on this buildup and then on the munitions that have been dropped in the last week, right? And I'll say very quickly, the strategy of the United States and Israel has been to degrade Iran's offensive and defensive capacities as rapidly as possible and to achieve air superiority over Iran. Israel claims that that has been achieved, that 80% of the air defense systems have been degraded or destroyed, and it appears that Israel jets are now flying sorties over Iran with little resistance, right? They're not worried about being shot down, and so they're going after the Revolutionary Guard infrastructure in the last 24 hours. And so I'll say this directly. I think that that strategy appears to be succeeding. I will then note very quickly, right, to two things you hear in military analysis, right? The first is strategy usually lasts until the first encounter with hostile forces, right? And so will this strategy continue to be the strategy that works, or does it go as planned? But I think more importantly, amateurs discuss strategy, experts examine supply lines. And there is, I think, a genuine question about how much we have emptied our arsenals of our most sophisticated weapons in the first week of this war, how many Patriot missiles remained to intercept Iranian attacks, how many of our best guided cruise missiles remain, and in particular, whether or not, having gone all in the first week of this war, we retain the capacity on the one hand to continue to fight at something like this rate using similar munitions, or whether we're going to have to fall back to less sophisticated, less accurate, therefore more likely to cause civilian casualties munitions as the war progresses. And then to just note, right, with such a large concentration of our forces and so many of our weapons being used and therefore depleted in this one conflict, are we still capable? Is the United States still capable of projecting force in other theaters should it be necessary? And of course, I think the thing you wonder about is, with the United States preoccupied in Iran, who else decides this is an opportune time to do things that were the United States not preoccupied, we wouldn't otherwise do. They wouldn't otherwise do. And so, of course, I'm talking about China and Taiwan, Vladimir Putin, and whether he escalates in Ukraine or even extends beyond Ukraine. And I'll just say this very quickly, right? There is another scenario, which is that actually the regime in Iran does collapse quickly enough for the United States to retain some of its arsenal and some of its capacity to project force. And China and Russia look at us and say, wow, we got to be careful in the remaining years of the Trump presidency because their weapons are the most sophisticated in the world, and this president is willing to use them. So these are, I think, things that we will only know as we watch this war unfold. Finally, right, this idea: amateurs discuss strategy, experts examine supply lines. How much longer can we supply and sustain these right levels of conflict? I think it really is an open question. Asymmetrical war of defensive attrition, right? The idea that Iran knows it can't win this war, right? Yeah, I'm sure it would like nothing better than to strike an American ship or to do substantial damage to some of our aircraft or our troops. But the idea of the real strategy of Iran being in ways that we talked about last time, simply to survive. And then as the regime survives, make this war as long, wide, expensive as possible. And that they have been doing this for the last week. I have on the board, right, a satellite image of a thawed radar array that was destroyed by Iranian missiles in Jordan. And I'll say this very briefly. These arrays cost between $300 million and $500 million, right? And it's not just this one. It appears that two others have been at least partially damaged or targeted. We don't have precise information. This one we've got a clear satellite view of. But the idea that potentially, right, $1 billion of damage has been done by $100,000 of Iranian drones. I don't know exactly what did this damage, but this is the kind of strategy that they're pursuing. Shut the Strait of Hormuz, strangle the world's supply of, right, oil, natural gas, fertilizer. There's a lot that comes out of this region. Make this war such that Americans are seeing carnage on their TVs, feeling the pain at their gas pumps, and then maybe Donald Trump will lose courage, and the result will be that this regime survives and then rebuilds its capacity slowly. We know, of course, that Ayatollah Ali Khamenei has been killed. We also know that several of his top security officials have been killed. I want to spend more time with you today analyzing the Iranian regime insofar as I understand it. And I'll say quickly, I'm no expert in this. I've done my best to do a quick study. I hope what I'm saying is reasonably accurate, and that this is, right, one would hope, the kind of information that the President of the United States would have much better access to because of the intelligence gathering apparatus that supports the president. But nevertheless, I will suggest that it doesn't appear that the president really understands the nature of the Iranian regime. So this is a little bit to do with the organization of the state, as I understand it, right? With the supreme leader at the very top of the state, right? And now he is dead. We don't know whether the assembly of experts, I'll get to them in a moment, but they elect the supreme leader, whether or not, they have elected another leader. And in part because with the US and Israel putting right bullseyes on the back of the leadership of this regime, even if there is a new supreme leader, they may not want to identify him for fear that it would result in his right being targeted and perhaps killed. Directly beneath the Supreme Leader is the Supreme National Security Council, then top security officials, then the Expediency Council, which is meant to arbitrate differences between state structure and theocratic structure, right? If there's some failure to come to agreement, then how do you reconcile the differences? The judiciary, the guardian council, the cabinet, and the president. And I would just note this is a pyramidic structure with the supreme leader at the top and the president at the bottom, right? So in Iran, the presidency is not a particularly powerful office. Part of what we've seen is the current president, Pezeshkian, actually apologizing to his neighbors for having attacked them right today, and the idea that probably the regime is going to continue to attack them because he's not powerful enough to direct what the Republican Guard, etc., do. Right. I'll say this very quickly. Right. It's not just Khomeini who was killed, but a number of top military and intelligence officials. It looks like in excess of 40 high-ranking regime officials have now been killed in the last week. And we've heard Donald Trump say that he had in mind people who might lead the regime after Khomeini was killed. And it appears that some of these 4 people were at the top of his list. And I'm just going to say this very quickly, right? You can see visually, right, that none of these men is wearing a turban. None of these men is a cleric. The supreme leader, the head of the government of Iran, is elected by the Assembly of Experts, all of whom are Shia clerics, right? And the qualification to be a supreme leader is that you be a Shia cleric, that you govern a theocratic regime with, right, appropriate religious expertise, right? And so in this sense, I'll say this briefly, Donald Trump may have been thinking that once you took out Khomeini, you would take out the entire regime. This is a so-called decapitation attack. And what we've seen, this seems to be Washington speak right now, is that the Maduro Venezuela model is that you get regime 2.0, right? That the original Chavez Maduro regime in Venezuela was a socialist populist regime that nationalized the oil resources, and that was a thorn in the side of America and encouraging politics in the region hostile to us. Now Maduro's gone, and the regime is actually behaving in a rather different way, a much more compliant way, because we showed them if you don't comply with us, if you don't stop interfering with our ambition for hegemony in the region, we can take you out, right? But I don't think that this strategy works in Iran. I think, right, you've got not a decade-long movement, but a movement that's nearly 50 years old. And you have a much larger and richer society, but you also have, right, a theocratic messianic ideology, and you have roughly 15% of the population who supports it, and roughly 2% of the population who's under arms and been enriched by this regime, some of them dramatically, right? And so you have created the oligarchs who very often support a personalistic dictatorship and institutionalized their power. The idea that this regime has staying power in the way that Venezuela doesn't means that suggesting that it's going to be headed by a secular security official as opposed to another Ayatollah is either wishful thinking or reflects ignorance or confusion, right? And so I've been emphasizing, I'll now be explicit about it, that the right assembly of experts, right, pre-approves whoever gets to run for president in other offices, right? The idea that Iran has regular elections, that they are not free, that they are not fair, right? That the Council of Experts determines who the candidates can be, not the people themselves, but that they are also not entirely predictable because once they've narrowed the field, they allow the election to take place. I've got one more box on the screen here, and it has on it really only one living person, and that is Ali Larijani, who is the Secretary of the Supreme National Security Council, the pinnacle of power beneath the Supreme Leader. And as Ayatollah Khamenei got older, more and more of the day-to-day operation of government was handled by Larijani, and he has survived so far as we know. And he is it appears on the basis of people who have interviewed or worked with him, a competent, energetic, smart, and totally committed member of this regime, right? And so the idea that the regime may actually pretty well continue to function without Khomeini in place, I think, is another important thing to notice. Now, I'm going to say this very quickly. The idea that when Maduro fell, it was an open question whether or not Venezuela and the regime in Venezuela would continue to function in the way that it had when Maduro was at its head, was right. That was something that we had to wait and see. And in fact, the regime did become more compliant. This, I think, has encouraged Donald Trump to think that this right model of regime modification, not regime change, cut off its head, and then the people who rise to replace it will be more compliant, would work in Iran. I am skeptical that it will work in Iran, but I have to note, right, that we're in the realm of the unpredictable at this moment. We will have to wait and see. The idea that U.S. intelligence, right, did an analysis in February and found that an attack on Iran would be unlikely to result in regime change, even the kind of attack we're having right now, apparently. The idea that I think I just did something I didn't want to do. Give me a second to see if I can get back to where I want to be. The idea that the right nuclear facilities have been damaged. Yeah. So I think, are you seeing my slides still?
Yes.
Okay, good. Somehow I got this into a view that I don't want. Let me. I think I'm not gonna. Oh, there it is. Okay. Now I see what I want to do. Okay, so the idea that the nuclear facilities that survived the 12-day war in June have been further damaged, I think is important to note. The idea, and I like this slide, I'm going to show it to you briefly, that right in the 12-day war in June, right, this missile production warehouse was obliterated, that by the time we got to the middle of February, it had been rebuilt and was in fact operational again, that today it is again obliterated, and that if right the regime survives, it is likely that it will continue to rebuild its capacity. So I've got a window saying my screen sharing is paused. Are you seeing what I'm pointing you to?
Don't see your pointer.
You see my pointer, but you see my slides, correct?
Oh,
See your
Yes.
slides.
Okay, excellent. Then that's all that really matters right now. So let me keep going. Oh, now I'm seeing something that for some reason I hit the wrong button, and now I can't advance my slides. So come on. Um, okay, I think I'm figuring out how to do this. Okay, let me come out and go back, and hopefully this works. Sorry for the technical difficulty. There's a button that I didn't know what it was that I inadvertently hit. What are you seeing now? Anything?
No,
Yeah.
Blank.
And now the slides, right?
yes,
now
yes.
we see
Okay,
five.
good. And now I can advance. And sorry for the screw up there. The thing about the regime, right? So to just go back for a second, right? We are targeting not just the military facilities, the airport, the police station. We're really trying to take out the capacity of the regime to repress its own people, so that the people may feel safety in rising up against the regime. Or to put it differently, that the people, the functionaries, who have to employ the instruments of coercion against their own people feel so embattled, so endangered, that they lay down their arms, and the people are then able to safely rise up and create a new regime. The problem here has to do with the power structure. And so this is a different way of diagramming where power resides in the Iranian regime. Again, the supreme leader is always at the top. There is, right, the armed forces, and this is the traditional military, right? We've got the ground forces, the air force, the air defense, the navy. By the way, I'm not really speaking about the sinking of the naval ships off the coast of Sri Lanka, apparently participating in a exercise with India, apparently unarmed. Again, quite possibly a war crime, one of at least several, right? The very invasion is probably illegal, not only within the Constitution, but under international law. Be that as it may, right? That's one of the agencies, right, we're trying to dismantle. There's traditional law enforcement, like the police station you just saw, and then special units. But then please note, right, that the largest in the diagram of power, but also in terms of personnel and resources, unit of the Iranian state is the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, right? And they have military forces and Air Force forces, but they also have their secret police, their Quds force, and the Bashi organization, which is arguably the elite domestic security forces, 150,000 of them, very well armed and very much willing and able to repress and mow down their own people, right? And so I gave the example of the Israeli effort to, right, destroy Hamas, right? And so the idea that the Revolutionary Guard Corps is perhaps halfway in between being a state or a state agency and being more like a paramilitary organization that fades into the civilian population when necessary and then reemerges when it's safe, I think gets at the extraordinary difficulty of dismantling this state so long as this pillar of the state remains intact. And if the Revolutionary Guard Corps stays intact and maintains its nerve, its resolve, its willingness to repress its own people, including using lethal force against them, I don't know that this regime can collapse merely because of a sustained air campaign as opposed to a ground occupation. So the fact that, right, and here we've got a more complete diagram of the people who've been killed and the people who remain. I won't, in light of limits of time, go into too much of the details here, right? But in various quadrants of the regime, leadership has been killed, as many as 40 people, but the regime maintains near total monopoly on the capacity for violence. And its paramilitary troops show no hesitancy in their willingness to use that violence against their own people. This willingness to repress is structurally rooted, right? It's not just that these are fanatics or sadists, it's that their privileges, their wealth, and their vulnerability to reprisal should the regime collapse means that they've got every incentive. They're fighting for their lives. And they're going to, if that analysis is correct, continue to fight against their people, even if their people rise up. And so we then add to that, right? That the people of Iran, not the regime, right? The people who would have to actually, with great courage and bravery, face down the Revolutionary Guard Corps and without arms, right? Be willing in large numbers to sacrifice themselves in order to try to overpower their armed repressors, right? They recognize a couple of things. The first is that it appears Donald Trump has not really sold this war to the American people, and that this war is not very popular, right? And so the idea that his resolve may not last very long, may not last long enough to have their backs should they rise up. And then they look across their borders, right? They look to Iraq, they look to Syria, they look to Libya. And they say, what exactly happens in this region when the people try to change the regime, right? And they say, well, it looks like you add those three societies together, 900,000 people have died in the last 20 years in efforts for regime change. And actually, all of those societies appear to be worse off than they were under their oppressive regimes, at least in certain important metrics, right? Their economies are in shambles. There is more disorder. In certain respects, they're ruled by more fanatical or more repressive regimes, right? And so while I think it's absolutely correct to say, right, that the Iranian revolutionary regime is deeply unpopular domestically, isolated regionally, none of its neighbors like it, it nevertheless is going to be very hard to topple that regime with a decapitation attack or through air power alone. I'll say this very quickly, right? War is the perhaps most brutal condition that humans impose on each other. And we are beginning to see it, right? This war is still quite young. The fog of war is still quite dense. Our intelligence is limited. Our media presence is limited. Frankly, our patience or appetite for this may be leading our news agencies to pay less attention to it. If you see some of the stuff that Al Jazeera is showing, if you see some of the stuff coming out on Substacks or even from the European media, you will recognize immediately that the American media is not presenting the full human costs of the war to us, but those costs are being borne in the region. It's also the case, right, that what we're seeing is the price of oil hit a high that it hasn't been at since the beginning of this decade, the COVID the disruption to supply lines, the future of natural gas, futures of natural gas in Europe are trading almost 100% above where they were before this war broke out, that so much of the world's oil, fertilizer, fentanyl, other supplies, I didn't mean fentanyl, I'm sorry, the fertilizer, right, come through the Straits of Hormuz when 20% of the world's natural gas can be shut off in a moment, when 20% of its petroleum can be shut off, we should expect major disruptions to the world's economy. And again, that is what the Iranian regime is trying to impose on us as a cost of war. I have had a little bit of time to look at some of the polling data on this war, and it depends which poll you look at, right? The CNN poll shows things a little bit closer, right? With 59% of the American people disapproving of the war, 41% approving, a sharp partisan divide, the majority of Americans not believing that there was a real threat from Iran. And then we have a Reuters Ipsos poll showing only 27% of Americans approving of the war. Not popular, right? And it's not just that it's not popular, but it's that Donald Trump has done very little to build the case for this war. He did not try to justify it in advance. Apparently, the fact that he wanted to surprise Iran led him also to surprise the American people with this campaign. I'm not sure, right, whether it will actually drive his popularity down further. His popularity is already quite dismal. It's showing some signs of slightly improving just over the last week. But having said that, um, the nuclear attack on Iran, right, the growing campaign in Gaza and the American support for it, Maduro captured. None of this appears to have impacted his standing in the polls. Americans seem to be more focused on domestic issues. But having said that, the fact that this is clearly illegal under the United States Constitution, Article 1, Section 8 says very clearly, right, that Congress has the power to declare war, not the President of the United States. And obviously, this is a part of our Constitution that has become completely moribund and dysfunctional. Congress has not declared war since World War II, right? We have had some authorizations for the use of military force. I'm sure that Donald Trump's lawyers have produced a memo arguing that one of those authorizations justifies this campaign. But I'll just note very quickly, right? This is not an administration that cares very much about legality or constitutionality. And so I'm sure that memo is just cover for what the president wanted to do. And so I'll say very quickly, both Republicans and the Iranian regime are watching these numbers. Republicans, because they're trying to figure out how much longer do they stand with the president. And it's difficult, right? Because, right, you don't want to be seen as betraying your president in the middle of a war, especially if there is some chance that the war will succeed. But having said that, you also don't want to go into a midterm election saddled with having enabled a president to conduct a catastrophically destructive war that comes back to bite you. The Iranians are watching it, of course, because they're trying to determine how much longer will Donald Trump actually have an appetite to do this? How much longer do they have to sustain these attacks? How much longer can they hold on for? I want to say one more thing about Trump's approach to this, right? And it's not just that he hasn't tried to really build the case in advance of the war, and so he enters the war with very little of the case being made, very little support for it, very little, right, of an argument about its necessity or legality. I think it's more than that, right? I think when Donald Trump, from day to day to day, changes the reason right, that he is giving to the American people. When he changes his right understanding of what we're doing in this war. Is it regime change? Is it not? Is it occupation? Is it not? How long is it going to last? Is there a 4 week maximum, or could it go on indefinitely? He displays, he reveals his disdain for the intelligence of the American public. He thinks basically that his base will follow him wherever he goes, and he can shop these explanations to see which one works for the largest number of people. And that suggests, right, that people are easily manipulated, and that he's a master manipulator. And I have to say, in many respects, he's right about that. But when the curtain is pulled back and you're revealed to be simply manipulating people and disrespectful of them, not right, willing to actually seek their authorization, but just going wherever your hunch, your gut takes you, that does not, right, do very well in a democratic society. And then, in addition to his disdain for the intelligence of the public, which I think is increasingly manifest, there's also the disdain for the intelligence of his own government, right? There is, right, very little strategy, very little planning. One of the analysts I saw interviewed about this said, look, this is foreign policy that is operating like improvisational jazz. They're just making it up. They're improvising as if it goes along. Um, and I think that is also increasingly transparent, as finally is Donald Trump's vanity. And the idea that this is not just a war of choice, it's a war in which Donald Trump felt like he could be shown to be smarter, stronger, more courageous than anyone who'd come before him, when in fact, right, he's merely playing the part. I do really like the cartoon cover of the forthcoming New Yorker, Donald Trump as MacArthur, except right on a golf course, being driven in a golf court by Hegseth. But I also bring in at this point Robert Pape's bombing to win, and in this book the argument is that you almost never win in war by air power alone. So the idea, and let me not reprise this further, right? But that the rapid and positive regime change seems unlikely, and it's unlikely to be a democracy that emerges from this. The best case, I think, would be more of a nationalist government that looks after Iran's economic interests, and the takes advantage of its resources and its human capital, which are tremendous, right? And actually modernizes Iran, and makes it the kind of regional power and society it could be. But more likely is a long and costly ground war, especially if Trump and Netanyahu are serious about unconditional surrender or regime change. It's almost impossible to do this, Pape argues, without occupation and long-term commitment of troops to help a new government take hold. And that will be especially the case in Iran, where there is not a well-organized opposition. So regime collapse, civil war, or dismemberment. And by the way, right, we see talk of arming the Kurds in Iraq to invade Iran and create an autonomous Kurdistan out of a portion of Iran. It appears that this is very, very unpopular in Iran, right? Iran has been more or less a continuously existing, proud, and accomplished, deep, artistic, and mathematical, and civilizational project for 3 millennia, 5 millennia, depending upon how you measure, and many Iranians, right? The society is roughly 60% Persian, 40% other ethnic, linguistic, religious groups, but very few of them actually want to see Iran dismembered, and the threat that it will be dismembered by one of its ethnic groups is I think, something that is actually likely to drive the people maybe to support the regime. I want to just note, right, the costs of scenario 2 and 3, right, and costs in terms of the number of lives that will be lost, especially Iranian lives, but also the cost to American society, and so I don't mean to shift dramatically and immediately from the people who will die in Iran to the right depletion of our treasury. But I do think I want to say this very directly. Donald Trump would not be in office were it not for the costly, long, destructive wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. And the idea that, right, and I wanted to show you this quickly, right, that the cost of those wars was ultimately roughly $8 trillion, according to Brown's Watson School, and I think they do very good analysis of all the costs. The costs in terms of lives, almost or in excess of 900,000 people, right? And that Iran is much bigger, right? Population wise, territorially, in terms of its regional influence, in terms of its resources, and therefore much more likely to be costly and destructive than those wars were. Um, this is something that has to be weighed in thinking about the second or the third scenario. And by the way, that this is likely to produce the largest refugee crisis in Europe since World War II. Iran has a border with Turkey. People are already streaming over that border. Turkey gives them access to Europe. What will happen in European politics? The final thing I want to share with you briefly. I'm sorry, I know I'm going fast. I'm trying to conclude not too far over time. Um, the idea that regime change almost always fails, right? And so I have the, I think, really interesting article on Iran by Karim Sajidapur, I think a really important American Iranian analyst of contemporary Iranian politics, and his claim that statistically 4 out of 5 regime change efforts fail. They almost never replace a bad regime with a better regime, and especially unlikely to succeed is so-called foreign imposed regime change, as opposed to regime change that occurs because there is a well-organized movement within the society that can create, if you will, a shadow regime once the old regime collapses to have structure and order in its place. I'm also drawing on Philip Gordon's Losing the Long Game, The False Promise of Regime Change, and then Dexter Filkin's old but still very good book about the failure of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, the Forever War. And the points these books make very quickly. Removing a regime is much easier than putting a better regime in its place. That our capacity, our right asymmetrical strategic advantage is military, right? And that allows us to destroy the infrastructure of a regime, especially if the regime is organized as a traditional state with a military. It's easy for us to overwhelm the military to produce the surrender or the death of the leader, but that does not automatically produce an alternative regime, right? And it's much harder to construct than to destroy, and it's almost impossible to use military means alone to build an alternative regime. That requires the indigenous effort of the people of the society. And if, right, they have just suffered catastrophic losses from war, if they haven't had the experience of building their own internal movement and organization, often a security vacuum emerges, and then cutthroat competition for power, and those who emerge in that struggle are the most ruthless and therefore the least likely to put in place a better regime. the costs of conflict following regime change can be worse than the original regime. And I just want to emphasize this for a moment. I think, right, maybe 85% of the people of Iran, that's based on a poll, which is hard to do, but a substantial majority of the people of Iran want to see the Islamic revolutionary regime overthrown and replaced with a better regime. But when they look to their neighbors and say to themselves, what is the outcome when they try regime change, especially when they do so with the right military backing of the United States? It isn't, right, a better regime. It is chaos. It is civil war. It is, right, the absolute disorganization of the society, sectarian violence, and loss of trillions of dollars in the aftermath of these wars and these transitions. Actually, maybe the alternative to the Islamic Republic is worse than the Islamic Republic. If we get, right, say the Kurds to help us in bringing about regime change, very often the allies that we find on the ground appear to share or parrot our interests in the short term, but in the long term, nationalism, domestic considerations lead them to develop their own interests, and things turn out very differently from what we had hoped for, right? Which is obviously the Iraqi case. Our staying power is limited, right? And I think especially as mercurial and unfocused as Donald Trump is, as apparently ill-advised and poorly thought out as this war is, as costly as it's likely to become quickly, the idea that he's not going to stay the course is also going to influence the incentives on the ground. The regime is going to dig in and try to survive until Donald Trump withdraws. And the people of Iran may know this, and this may lead them to be cautious, right? Democracy is elusive in the Middle East, and especially if what we're concerned about, and I'll say this very quickly, right, is really proliferation. And at some level, I do think it's absolutely appropriate to be concerned about Iran having a nuclear bomb. It would be catastrophic. I don't think they were anywhere near having that capacity. They've been trying to do it for 30 years, and for 30 years, we and Israel have been successful in thwarting them, and it's not easy to do, right? But if we're serious about countering the proliferation of nuclear weapons at a moment where there are, right, a lot of countries trying to acquire them or trying to increase their stockpiles of them, where nationalism may be at an all-time high for the last century, where it's increasingly likely, therefore, that if countries have these weapons, they may end up in war and they may end up deployed. Well, diplomacy, deterrence, actual negotiated settlements, right, are, I think, more reliable instruments than regime change. And I'll say this very quickly. Part of what we have done, right, part of what Donald Trump and his administration have done is to attack Iran twice in the middle of nuclear negotiations, right? After having withdrawn from a treaty that in, right, 2018, Trump, when he was first in office, pulled out of, that had been painstakingly negotiated over the course of many, many years, right? And that prevented Iran from developing nuclear weapons, that anybody else looking at this, I think, has to say, as long as Donald Trump is president, maybe because someone like him can be president who knows when, every 4 years there's a new opportunity, the United States is not a reliable partner. You cannot trust that they will actually not pull out of the treaty they negotiate with you and then pretty soon attack you because you're not doing what they want you to do. And this actually diminishes our capacity to prevent the spread of nuclear weapons in the most reliable way. All right, so I've managed to share much of what I wanted to share with you today. I do know I've run long. Let's open it up for your thoughts. Who wants to start us out today?
I'll start something.
Go ahead,
Okay,
please,
and
And
then
I see you,
Flossie.
Flossie. Let's
Yeah,
let Ann go first, and then Flossie, you'll have to figure out how to unmute yourself. Remember.
yeah. Th Among all the awful things that are going on and that you've mentioned today, the flippancy of Hegseth and Trump is just so scary. I mean, these people are not in this world. I don't know where they are, but they're just off in La La Land, and that is very frightening.
Yeah, or social media land. Would be the way I
Same thing.
and so yes,
No, it's
as I
more
said,
than
oh, go ahead, Ann.
it's more than that. It's their flippancy.
Well,
It's
but
not
so
just
social.
conspiracy theories, but oh yeah, well, yeah, there'll be some people lost, I guess. This is hardly it makes no sense.
Well, so I think many of us don't use social media and particularly don't participate in social media by posting repeatedly politically provocative statements on social media. But the idea that what social media does is put you in potentially an echo chamber where no matter how kooky or irresponsible or untrue what you're saying is, you attract, right, a sufficient number of people who agree with you that it lends you credibility. It makes you think that you're actually being confirmed in your beliefs by anonymous, right, others who represent something like public opinion, right? I won't say this in detail today, but you go all the way back to Immanuel Kant and the idea of enlightenment. What is enlightenment? That public opinion is actually a really good measure of the defensibility of an idea. And here you are spouting off your nonsense, and it's being confirmed by public opinion. I do think that social media gives rise to delusions on the part of people who spend too much time on it. And that Donald Trump and Pete Hegseth and many other members of this administration spend far too much time on social media. And so the idea, right, that the United States spends billions of dollars on collecting and analyzing intelligence, right? And that the president of the United States seems to be uninterested, seems to think that his decision making is superior to what all these other analysts are trying to share with him is a peculiar feature of the Trump administration, right? And it does speak to the recklessness, the heedlessness, the flippancy, the complete indifference. I'll add one more dimension to this, right? And the fact that the bombs are falling on brown people, right? That the immigration and customs enforcement operations are directed against brown people. And if you look at the way, in particular, brown and black people are treated in social media, in right-wing social media ecosystems, in Fox News as well, you begin to see the roots of the dehumanization that makes this kind of campaign possible and attractive.
Mm.
Yeah, and thank you. Good comment. David, I see your hand. Flossie, have you been able to unmute yourself? You're still muted. Got to push that space bar down. There you go. Go ahead, Flossie.
Two things.
No, no, no. Hold the space bar down, Flossie. We lost you.
For a bunch of oldies, we have two forces at work here. A group that is out fighting and is politically aware for what it is fighting. We're still out on the streets. I missed the last parade because I was turning into a snail. I have to fight that even though I'm old enough to be a snail. But there is a real effort to be thinking about what is happening. And of course, that's why we listen to you as we do. But there's also another effort that says, in effect, enjoy your age and think about doing things that are pleasant to do. Be happy eating and drinking and going places. And I think that's lovely. And I would like to do that too. But I also see it as a kind of um a kind of medicine to keep you asleep. Not consciously, but it's there. I see it among some of my younger friends. When I mean younger, I mean they're 50. That's young. Um, Former students who just want to go away. They don't want to think about what's happening. They just want to be alone. They want to play with their mechanical tools. And or they're busy writing poetry, and God bless them, it's good poetry. And they're busy doing interesting things, but they're not aware of what social media is doing to them. I guess it's a good idea that they're not aware of social media either. I guess that's a blessing. But I think that being with you every Saturday and sometimes having to miss other things that are equally pleasant and not so provocative is something healthy in our little estate. So thank you, dear.
Thank you, Flossie. And I'll say this very quickly. Well, I'll start with the quip that came to mind. Snails enjoy themselves too, but I'll add, look, that there's camaraderie, there's meaning, there's purpose in being politically engaged, right? And so there's another No King's Day coming up on I think March 28th, right? And the idea, sorry, that we're seeing in action what it's like to have a king, what it's like to have a president who launches a war on a whim and out of vanity and with no respect for the people that he's supposed to answer to or the Constitution that does not give him the power to do what he's doing. Right? You know, the monarchical ambition of Donald Trump just becomes, or the autocratic ambition, to put it in more direct terms, becomes more and more clear. And so we have to resist this. And by the way, there is a joy and a camaraderie in resisting it. And then you're speaking to what we do every Saturday morning. Yeah, I go back to the word solace, right? You know, that we come together to process this stuff. And, you know, a year and a half ago, it was a much happier occasion. And we were able to do things that were a little bit more intellectually sustained because the right news cycle was not moving so quickly that we were just constantly struggling to keep up with it. But I do find that talking together about awful stuff is the first step in building the resolve, the awareness, the intelligence, the strategy to do something about it. And so I know you guys do get out there and protest, and I'm very happy that we also get to come together and discuss things before you do that. David, go ahead.
Yeah, I had a couple of thoughts. The first is there's something about uh, uh, war by dropping bombs on people over there that makes it sort of abstract. Unlike hand-to-hand combat, where you have to experience the blood and guts of war yourself, and you see the consequences that it has very directly. With an abstract war, you can sort of dismiss the carnage because it's not you don't see it, you don't feel it. It's over there, and I think that there ought to be a law that says that if you're going to have war, you have to fight in trenches and see what happens as a consequence of your shooting that gun and the like. The second thought is I notice amongst a lot of pundits and pundits who I respect a kind of a, well, it's just terrible that we got into it. But since we're into it, Iran is so awful that let's see what we can do to sort of take advantage of this misguided opportunity to do something that's right, and that is to destroy that regime that's been so awful on its own people and the rest of the Middle East and the world and the like. And I noticed that in David Brooks last night on PBS. I noticed it 2 days ago in Tom Friedman's very elaborate, uh, kind of justification for let's seize this opportunity, even though it was conceptualized in evil itself.
Um, so speaking to the second point first, um, I outlined three scenarios, right? And one of those scenarios has a good ending, and in the sense that yes, the people of Iran are long suffering. The regime in Iran is, an awful, repressive, terroristic, imperial regime, right? And so, um, you know, were it the case that this ended with the destruction of that regime and then its replacement by a better regime, I think we would have to celebrate that and give some credit to Donald Trump, even though probably it's more that he got lucky than that he actually had some brilliant strategic insight, right? What worries me, and the analogy that I'll give is, it's like putting a big bet on a roulette wheel on a specific number, right? If you win, you're going to be very happy, but the likelihood that you're going to win is 1 in 100, right? And when you're playing with the Treasury of the United States, when you're depleting the arsenal of the United States, which has other things that it needs to support, and when the cost of your gamble is the lives of the people of the society that you are intervening in, then it's beyond irresponsible. It's unconscionable to put that much right at risk on a very unlikely outcome. So yes, the idea that Donald Trump just doesn't understand the gravity of what he's doing is probably uh, morally incapable, given the way he's lived his life, of understanding the stakes. What has weighed heavily, I think, on almost every other president appears to just be something that Donald Trump, doesn't care about. Back to your first point, right? I don't think we can legislate hand-to-hand combat anymore. But having said that, the idea, and I'll just say this very briefly, right? I don't know if you followed, but there was a dispute in the immediate buildup to this war between Anthropic and the U.S. military, with Pete Hegseth at the front of it, about how Anthropic's artificial intelligence technology be integrated into the U.S. military, right? And that we're moving not in the direction of stronger um, uh, feedback about the tremendous inhumanity of war, but quite the opposite, right? Completely automated warfare in which, right, humans don't even have to be in the loop of the decision making about the use of lethal power. We're not all the way there yet, but the idea that Anthropic tried to pull the brakes a little bit and that Hegseth didn't just say no, but actually threatened to basically destroy the company if it didn't heed his demands, and that then OpenAI rushed in to take Anthropic's place. I think it's a really, really worrisome dynamic, not only about war, which I think it's going to make more and more inhumane, ruthless, but also about the use of this technology to surveil citizens, to control us. I think a digitally enhanced surveillance state is no longer the stuff of science fiction, but is just the frontier of the actual technology that we have. It's going to become easier and easier to be more and more repressive at home, in addition to dehumanizing the conduct of war. So yeah, I think those are real concerns. That stuff I'm actually, it's funny, I could pick up right now the books. I'm on spring break as of 24 hours ago, and I'm reading about AI and I'm sorry, the age of extraction because I'm getting ready to start writing on this stuff. I think it's very disturbing. Um,
Can I say one more thing?
of course.
The third thing that concerns me, and I just read a couple of pieces about this yesterday, is that by focusing so much energy on Iran, we're sort of abdicating our role as, policemen of the world to make sure that all is right everywhere, and opening up opportunities for particularly China to step in areas that we've left, now unguarded because of sending so much of our air and naval resources to the Middle East. Yeah.
Yeah, and I want to be critical, right? That the idea that we can sustain the role of policeman of the world or that we play it well, right? I don't I think in a sense Donald Trump is right that that's not a role that we can really continue to play. But the idea that in its place we should just maximize our narrow interests in a right uh, Machiavellian take advantage of our power kind of way, right? And the idea, right, that as a result of these kinds of campaigns, yes, China and Russia and Turkey and Hungary, take whatever right nationalistic bad actor you want. We're no longer going to be able to wag our finger at them and say international law prevents you from right doing this because we've done it so many times, right? At this point, that the hypocrisy of our invocation of international law is going to undermine our credibility, our moral authority. It's going to be in tatters. But then the second thing, right? And you know, there is an outcome here in which, right, the United States actually succeeds in making the Iranian regime collapse under the weight of our sustained bombing, right? And we emerge from this stronger, and maybe China and Russia are a little bit more intimidated by us. But there's another entirely, I think, likely scenario, which is that we actually deplete our arsenals. And in the literal sense, we just use up too many of our missiles. Half of our mobile air power is in the Gulf right now, right? And have I mentioned that we've dropped on Iran more bombs in a week than we provided to Ukraine in 3 years, right? You know, the idea that we are depleting our limited resources and that we don't have the industrial infrastructure to build up a new supply quickly, right? You may have seen Lockheed Martin meeting with Donald Trump yesterday in the White House, and the CEO came out and said, we're going to do our best to ramp up production of what the president needs. And by 2030, we'll be able to meet these demands, right? You know, what if China watches that news and says, well, maybe 2026, 2027 is a good time to take advantage of the opportunity of the United States having used up most of its supply of missiles with that campaign in Iran. Let's take Taiwan while the taking is good. Yeah, I do worry not that we should be the policemen of the world, but we should be at least savvy in our use of our limited resources and strategic in choosing which of the possible theaters where we could be engaged we need to reserve our most right powerful potential for. So, yeah, thank you, David. All right, guys, we went really long today. You got to get to lunch. I got to get to lunch. Wonderful being with you guys, even though the times are dark and the news is hard. I do always appreciate the chance to mull it over with you guys. You always have good ideas. Thank you as always. We'll talk again next week. Be well, guys, and heed Flossie's advice. Fight the good fight and restore yourself by enjoying yourselves as well. Take care, everybody. See you next week. Thank you. Bye bye.
Thank you, David.
Pleasure as always.